There's been a lot of talk about how there are too many transported to another world or isekai stories out right now.
We've seen countless isekai or other world shows over the years.
We need about 10 million fucking new ones every season now.
It's not just in the West either, with several light novel contests being run by publishers banning isekai stories, suggesting that they think the market is oversaturated too. Also, this genre has started having some really bizarre titles coming out, like a boy who's reincarnated in another world as a hot spring, and a boy who's transported to a fantasy world where he levels up literally by breathing. And of course, both covers prominently feature well-endowed ladies, so I guess they know how they're selling their volumes. Anyways, given all that, it's hardly surprising there's a fair amount of negativity around the isekai genre. That being said, I don't think the popularity of this genre is just a fluke brought upon by the meteoric rise of a certain controversial series. Rather, I think there's a couple of things the isekai genre does really well, namely world building and escapism. And that's what I want to talk about today. Isekai stories are essentially an offshoot of the fantasy genre, and like any other fantasy genre, being able to drop the reader into a fantastical world is incredibly important. Here though, they have a huge advantage. In most fantasy stories, the protagonist is already intimately familiar with the world, because they grew up in it, so world building is tricky to work in. Often the author will have to cut away from the current events of the story to explain the world, and this slows down pacing. Isekai stories don't have that problem though. Generally, the protagonist knows nothing about the world they travel to, and as a result, learning about the world becomes part of the plot as opposed to a divergence from it. This doesn't just improve pacing though. Since it's an entirely new world to the protagonist, we get to see it through unjaded eyes, and the protagonist will feel the same sense of wonder we feel when exploring it. Unraveling the mysteries of the world as the story progresses becomes a real joy and selling point of the series, as opposed to a drag on it. Now, some of you might be saying, what about stuck in a video game isekai stories like Overlord, SAO, and Log Horizon? The protagonists in those stories are already intimately familiar with the worlds they get transported to. And while yes, that is true, the audience also knows a fair bit about it because of the RPG rules. Most people will have already played at least one RPG going into any of these stories, so once again, the world building is sped along. This also allows for more complex systems to be introduced to the world because the author already has a pre-existing base to build off of. The various mechanisms for growth in something like Shield Hero would take forever to explain if used in a more standard high fantasy context. But because the reader has already encountered many similar systems in games before, you can get a lot of depth with relatively little effort. Also, although the worlds aren't new to the protagonist, they can still have a sense of wonder about them. What nerd hasn't fantasized about being able to immerse themselves in a video game as thoroughly as you can do with something like Nerve Gear? And seeing games as something not simply to play, but actually somewhere to live is fantastical. Now, let's be frank, while good world building is nice and all, the real draw of most isekai stories is escapism. To just forget about your everyday life, your problems with school, relationships, and work, and slip into a fantasy world. There are a number of genres that feature escapism and living out fantasies. In fact, that's generally why I read light novels and watch anime. But I feel like the isekai genre tends to do it better than most. First, it presents a protagonist that is similar to ourselves. Someone who actually grew up on Earth, who doesn't have special powers, and often tends to be geeky and or introverted. Then, when they're transported to the fantasy world, we can actually picture it as us. I know at least for myself, if I'm really into a story, I daydream about being in that world, and this style of story meshes perfectly with those daydreams. The protagonists tend to also react in a more relatable way because they have an experience set similar to our own, and their reactions are much more vibrant than someone who is born into that fantasy world. It's a joy to watch Sora and Shiro get excited about Discboard and discover the existence of things they'd only dreamed of, like Nekomimi. And on the flip side, while the experiences of the characters of Haitu Genso no Grimgar are considerably less pleasant, I feel like I'd be in pretty much the same situation as them if I was thrust into a fantasy world. Those types of experiences I find much more engaging than, I want to be the ninja president, or let's go and find the legendary MacGuffin, because I can really put myself in the shoes of Sora or Haruhiro much more easily than Naruto or Luffy. Also, as an added bonus, this style of protagonist provides opportunities for humor by having the protagonist, like us, have certain expectations from fantasy tropes, and then having those tropes ignored or subverted. The most obvious example of this is Konosuba, which uses the subversion of tropes frequently for its humor. But it's also done in others like ReZero and Shield Hero 2. And it's a nice way to poke fun at the cliches of the fantasy genre. Now, aside from the whole relatability thing, isekai stories present two very powerful fantasies for Daydream. One of being able to reset your life, and another of going from being a cog in the machinery to having your actions be meaningful. For the whole reset thing, there's an element of this in almost every isekai story, although it's stronger in things like Mushoku Tensei where the protagonist is literally reborn as a baby. I think it's always interesting to think about what you would do differently if you could start again. Getting to watch the protagonist start a new life and try and avoid all the mistakes they made in the old can be instructive as it makes you think more carefully about your own choices that you can't reset. Also, watching people do something right after messing up just feels satisfying. As for the second fantasy, most isekai protags gain some sort of power as they transfer to another world, and this lets them go from some position of being a niche or salaryman to someone who has a real impact. This is a great escape, not only for people who aren't satisfied with their current lives, but even just for people who've had a bad day. When I've had a rough time at the lab and none of my experiments are working, reading or watching isekai stories is a great way to unwind, watching people actually accomplish things. I guess it's a kind of similar appeal to an RPG. As long as you put time into it, meaningful stuff happens. And that's a nice contrast to the way the real world works sometimes. In summary, what I'm trying to say here is that isekai stories are popular for a reason. They create wondrous worlds and provide an escape into them, which is something that there is a need for. No one's life is perfect, and the real world can be depressing as hell. We need another world to escape to sometimes, and there's nothing wrong with that. Actually, it's pretty healthy. Better to escape through books than booze. Long live the isekai story. May their quantity never distract from their quality, because there are a lot of good ones. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for listening. Cheers!